The first sign that something had changed was the silence. Thicket awoke from his restless slumber, immediately alert to the absence of the usual dungeon sounds, the distant drip of water, the scuttling of unseen creatures, the occasional moan of some tortured soul. The air felt different too, charged with an energy that made his scales prickle and his twisted horns ache. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, a shock ran through his monstrous form. His lair, a cavern he had known intimately for centuries, was wrong. The familiar stalactites that had hung from the ceiling like stone teeth were gone, replaced by smooth, almost polished rock. The pile of bones from his past victims, a grim trophy he'd both loathed and been compelled to maintain, had vanished without a trace. Thicket lumbered to his feet, claws scraping against what should have been rough stone, but now felt like marble. "What devilry is this?" he growled, his voice echoing strangely in the transformed space. A laugh, cold and cruel, reverberated through the chamber. The sorcerer's voice, dripping with malice, filled the air. "Ah, my pet. Did you think your little moment of defiance would go unpunished, you forced my hand beast? Let's see how you fare in a dungeon that shifts like the sands of time." The words faded, leaving Thicket alone in the unsettling silence once more. He moved cautiously towards where the entrance to his lair should have been, only to find a blank wall. Panic, an emotion he hadn't felt in ages, began to rise in his chest. He was trapped, sealed in by the sorcerer's magic. Just as claustrophobia threatened to overwhelm him, a section of the wall shimmered and became translucent. Beyond, Thicket could see a corridor he didn't recognize, twisting off into darkness. With no other choice, he stepped through the magical barrier. The new passageway was nothing like the dungeon he knew. Its walls were lined with strange, pulsing veins of crystal that emitted a sickly green light. The floor beneath his feet seemed to shift subtly with each step, as if it were alive. As Thicket rounded a corner, the green light flared brilliantly, momentarily blinding him. When his vision cleared, he found himself no longer in the corridor, but in a vast chamber he'd never seen before. And he wasn't alone. A group of adventurers stood before him, a knight in gleaming armor, a robed wizard, a lithe elven archer, and a burly dwarf. For a moment, Thicket felt a surge of hope. Had rescuers somehow breached the dungeon again? But something was wrong. Their eyes were vacant, their poses unnaturally still. As Thicket watched in growing horror, the figures flickered like images in a faulty magic lantern, and suddenly he knew. This wasn't real. At least, not anymore. The scene before him burst into motion. The knight charged, sword raised high. The wizard's hands crackled with arcane energy. The archer's bow twanged as arrows flew. And Thicket remembered. This had happened long ago. These adventurers had been real once. Brave souls who had ventured into his lair, seeking to end the terror of the dungeon. With sickening clarity, Thicket recalled what came next. His monstrous form moved of its own accord, reenacting events etched into the very fabric of his being. Claws raked through armor as if it were parchment. Fangs sank into flesh. Bone-crushing blows shattered bodies. In moments, it was over. The phantom adventurers lay broken on the ground, their vacant eyes now accusatory in death. Thicket staggered back, overwhelmed by the memory and the guilt that came crashing down upon him. "No," he moaned, "I didn't. I couldn't." But he had. The curse might have driven him, but the blood was on his claws. How many had he slain over the centuries? How many brave souls had met their end at his hands? The chamber flickered and faded, depositing Thicket back in the strange, crystal-veined corridor. He slumped against a wall, his mind reeling from the vivid flashback. In all his years of imprisonment, he had never fully confronted the atrocities he'd committed. The curse had kept him in a state of perpetual bloodlust, never allowing him to dwell on his actions. But now, with his mind clearer than it had been in centuries, the weight of his deeds threatened to crush him. A distant roar snapped Thicket out of his spiral of guilt. It seemed he wasn't the only denizen struggling with the dungeon's transformation. The sorcerer's voice echoed once more through the corridors. "The game has changed, my puppets. New rules, new playground. Adapt or be destroyed. Your move." Thicket pushed himself upright, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The sorcerer's game was cruel, but he wouldn't give in. Somehow, he would find a way through this shifting labyrinth of horrors. And perhaps, in facing the monsters of his past, he could finally begin to break the chains of his curse. But Thicket pressed on through the ever-changing corridors, his senses on high alert. The dungeon seemed to breathe around him, walls rippling like water, floors undulating beneath his feet. Each new chamber that materialized before him was a shock to his system, familiar yet distorted, like viewing his centuries-old prison through a warped mirror. As he entered a vast, cavernous space, the air shimmered, and Thicket found himself in what appeared to be an ancient temple. Crumbling pillars lined the walls, and at the far end stood a weathered altar. The scene tugged at the edges of his memory. Suddenly the temple came to life. Ghostly figures flickered into existence, men, women and children huddled in fear. They wore the simple garb of villagers, their faces etched with terror. An ethereal voice echoed through the chamber. "Please, great beast, we seek sanctuary from the war above. We mean no harm." Thicket's blood ran cold. He remembered this day, centuries ago. A group of refugees had fled into the dungeon, seeking shelter from some long-forgotten conflict in the world above. Before he could react, Thicket felt the familiar, horrible surge of the curse taking control. His spectral past self burst into the temple, a whirlwind of claw and fang. The refugee screams filled the air as the massacre began. No, Thicket roared, trying to stop the unfolding memory. But he was forced to watch, reliving every moment of the slaughter. When it was over, the phantom Thicket stood amid a sea of broken bodies, his monstrous form splattered with blood. The scene faded, leaving Thicket trembling in the now empty chamber. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though there was no one left to hear his apology. "I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't." The sorcerer's mocking laughter filled the air. "Ah, such delicious guilt. Do you see now, beast? This is what you are. This is all you'll ever be." Thicket snarled, fighting against the weight of his actions. "No," he growled. "I was not myself. Your curse." "My curse," the sorcerer interrupted. "Oh, but the potential for such cruelty was always within you. I merely unleashed it." The words struck Thicket like a physical blow. Could it be true? Was he always capable of such atrocities, curse or no curse? Before he could dwell on this, the chamber began to shift again. Thicket found himself in a twisting maze of mirrors, each reflecting a different moment from his blood-soaked past. In one, he saw himself tearing through a group of knights. In another, he stalked a lone adventurer through darkened corridors. Everywhere he turned, Thicket was confronted with the monster he had been. The monster part of him still was. The guilt was overwhelming, threatening to drag him into despair. But as he stumbled through the maze of memories, something unexpected happened. In one mirror, Thicket caught a glimpse of his true self, the majestic forest spirit he had once been. The image was fleeting, but it ignited a spark of hope within him. "I was more than this," Thicket murmured. "I can be more than this again." The sorcerer's voice returned, dripping with venom. "Fool! You think you can change? You think you can escape what you've become?" Thicket stood straighter, facing his reflections with newfound determination. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I will try." Enraged by this defiance, the sorcerer caused the dungeon to shift violently. Mirrors shattered, and the floor beneath Thicket's feet gave way. He fell through darkness, landing hard in yet another transformed area of the dungeon. This new zone was unlike anything Thicket had seen before. The walls pulsed with veins of dark energy, and the air itself seemed charged with malevolent magic. As Thicket explored, he realized with growing unease that this area felt newer, as if it had been recently created. "Welcome to the heart of your new home, beast," the sorcerer's disembodied voice announced. "Like it, I made it especially for you and your friends." Friends? Thicket's mind raced. Could some of his allies from the failed escape attempt have survived the dungeon's transformation? As if in answer to his unspoken question, a familiar voice called out from the shadows. "Thicket, is that you?" Thicket turned to see Grimclaw, the goblin chieftain, emerge from a hidden crevice. The goblin looked haggard, his usually cunning eyes wide with fear. "What's happening?" Grimclaw hissed. "The dungeon, it's all wrong. And these visions?" Thicket nodded grimly. "The sorcerer is playing a new game. He's reshaping the dungeon and forcing us to relive our worst memories." Grimclaw shuddered. "I've seen terrible things, old friend. Things I'd rather forget." "As have I," Thicket agreed. "But perhaps confronting these memories is the key to breaking free." The goblin looked skeptical but nodded. "So what do we do now?" Before Thicket could respond, the dungeon began to shift once more. The walls around them started to melt away, revealing a vast, otherworldly landscape beyond. Now Thicket growled, steeling himself for whatever new challenge awaited. "Now we adapt, we survive, and somehow we find a way to end this nightmare once and for all." And together, Thicket and Grimclaw stepped into the unknown, the ever-changing labyrinth of the dungeon stretching endlessly before them. Thicket and Grimclaw trudged through the ever-shifting landscape of the dungeon, their unlikely alliance born of shared suffering and a desperate hope for freedom. The goblin chieftain's presence was a small comfort in the face of the horrors they encountered, a reminder that Thicket was not alone in his struggle against the sorcerer's cruel machinations. As they rounded a corner, the air shimmered and the corridor before them transformed. The pulsing veins of dark energy receded, replaced by familiar, moss-covered stone walls. Thicket's eyes widened in recognition. This is part of the old dungeon," he growled, his voice a mixture of surprise and suspicion. Grimclaw nodded, his sharp eyes darting about. "Aye, but why would the sorcerer leave it unchanged? It must be a trap." Thicket considered this, then shook his massive head. "Perhaps his control isn't as absolute as he'd have us believe. We should explore carefully." As they ventured deeper into this pocket of familiarity, they began to hear sounds, whispers, shuffling movements, the clinking of chains. Rounding another bend, they came upon a scene that made even Thicket's monstrous heart clench with emotion. A group of dungeon denizens huddled together in what appeared to be an old storage room. Some Thicket recognized from the failed escape attempt Whisper the Wraith, hovering anxiously near the ceiling skitter, a particularly clever rat man, his fur matted and eyes wild and lurch, a lumbering troll who had once been a proud warrior before the curse twisted him. The assembled creatures recoiled at the sight of Thicket and Grimclaw, fear evident in their eyes. Thicket realized with a pang of guilt that they still saw him as the sorcerer's most fearsome enforcer. "Wait," he rumbled, trying to make his gravelly voice as unthreatening as possible. "We're not here to harm you. We're like you, trying to survive this new nightmare." Whisper drifted forward, her spectral form flickering with uncertainty. "The great beast speaks of survival, of nightmares. What trickery is this?" Grimclaw stepped forward, his goblin features set in a grim smile. "No trickery, Spirit. The sorcerer's game has changed, and with it, so have we. Thicket here nearly broke free of the curse. That's why everything's gone topsy-turvy." A murmur ran through the gathered creatures. Skitter scampered closer, whiskers twitching. "Is it true? Can the curse be broken?" Thicket sighed, a sound like grinding stones. "I don't know, but I intend to find out. And I think we'll have a better chance if we work together." The next hour was spent in hurried conversation, each creature sharing what they knew of the dungeon's transformation. They spoke of new areas appearing and old ones vanishing, of maddening visions and memories best left forgotten. Through it all, Thicket listened, feeling the weight of leadership settle upon his twisted shoulders. As the impromptu council wound down, Lurch the troll lumbered forward. "What we do now?" Boss he asked, looking to Thicket with a mixture of hope and fear. Thicket was taken aback by the title, but he squared his shoulders and addressed the group. "Now, we resist. We learn the patterns of this new dungeon. We watch each other's backs and keep our minds sharp against the sorcerer's illusions. And we look for a way to break this curse once and for all." A spark of determination ignited in the eyes of the gathered creatures. For the first time in centuries, they had a purpose beyond mere survival. As the group prepared to venture out into the unknown reaches of the transformed dungeon, Thicket pulled Grimclaw aside. "There's something I need to tell you," he rumbled. "Something I've been experiencing." In hushed tones, Thicket confided in the goblin about his vivid flashbacks, the crushing guilt, and his struggle to maintain his sense of self in the face of his past atrocities. To his surprise, Grimclaw nodded in understanding. "I've seen things too," old friend the goblin whispered, his voice heavy with emotion. "Terrible things I did, both before and after the curse. It's like the sorcerer wants us to drown in our own memories." Thicket felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. He wasn't alone in this internal battle. "How do you bear it?" he asked. Grimclaw's face hardened. "By remembering that while we can't change the past, we can shape the future. Every moment we resist, every act of kindness or courage, is a blow against the sorcerer and the monsters he made us become." Thicket nodded, feeling a newfound resolve steal his spirit. He turned to address the group once more, his voice ringing with determination. "Together, we'll unravel the secrets of this shifting labyrinth. We'll face our pasts, confront our guilt, and forge a new path. The sorcerer thinks he can break us with these visions, but he's wrong. Our memories, painful as they are, remind us of who we once were and who we can be again." A cheer went up from the assembled creatures, a sound that hadn't been heard in the dungeon for centuries. As it echoed through the corridors, Thicket could have sworn he felt the sorcerer's influence waver, just for a moment. The sorcerer's voice boomed through the dungeon, tinged with rage and perhaps a hint of fear. "You think your little rebellion changes anything? You are mine, now and forever." But as Thicket looked at the determined faces of his newfound allies, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time: hope. "Come," he growled, leading the way out of their temporary sanctuary. "We have a labyrinth to conquer and a curse to break." And with that, the unlikely band of rebels ventured forth into the shifting corridors, ready to face whatever horrors the dungeon might conjure. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger, and the ever-present risk of losing themselves to the curse once more. But for the first time in centuries, they faced it not as isolated monsters, but as a united force. The sorcerer's game had indeed changed, but perhaps not in the way he had intended. The ragtag band of rebels, led by Thicket, pushed deeper into the ever-shifting maze of the dungeon. Each step was a gamble, as familiar passages twisted into unknown territories and new horrors lurked around every corner. Yet they pressed on, bound by a shared determination to break free from the sorcerer's control. As they navigated the treacherous landscape, Thicket noticed a pattern emerging. No matter how randomly the dungeon seemed to reshape itself, certain paths always led them back to the newer sections, those pulsing with dark energy and malevolent magic. "There's something at the center of all this," Thicket growled to his companions. "A focal point for the sorcerer's power. If we can find it, we might be able to disrupt the curse." Whisper finished, her ethereal form shimmering with excitement. Guided by this revelation, the group began to purposefully navigate towards the heart of the transformed dungeon. The challenges grew more intense with each step. Illusions assaulted their senses, playing on their deepest fears and most painful memories. More than once, Thicket had to physically restrain allies lost in the throes of a particularly vivid vision. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of struggle, they emerged into a vast chamber unlike anything they had encountered before. The walls, floor, and ceiling were composed of a shifting, shadow-like substance that seemed to devour light. At the center of the room hovered a pulsating orb of pure darkness, crackling with eldritch energy. "By all the gods," Grimclaw whispered, his voice filled with awe and terror. "What is that thing?" Before Thicket could respond, the orb pulsed violently. Tendrils of dark energy lashed out, wrapping around each member of the group. Thicket roared in pain and defiance as he felt the familiar pull of the curse, stronger than ever before. And then the visions began. Thicket found himself reliving his most horrific memory, yet the massacre of the innocent refugees he had slaughtered centuries ago. But this time, it was different. He wasn't just watching the scene unfold, he was fully present, feeling every emotion, every cruel impulse, as if experiencing it for the first time. He felt the savage joy as his claws tore through flesh, heard the screams of the dying with perfect clarity. Worst of all, he felt the hunger, the insatiable desire to kill, to destroy, to give in fully to the monster he had become. "This is who you are," the sorcerer's voice echoed in his mind. "This is all you'll ever be. Embrace it, revel in it." For a moment, Thicket teetered on the brink of oblivion. The weight of his guilt, combined with the overwhelming sensations of the vision, threatened to shatter his sanity. He could feel his true self slipping away, the beast taking control. But then, cutting through the haze of blood and violence, he heard something else. Faint at first, but growing stronger, the voices of his companions. They were calling out to him, to each other, fighting against their own visions. Thicket, don't let it take you. We believe in you, boss. Remember who you were, who you can be again. Their words were a lifeline, anchoring Thicket to his true self. With a monumental effort of will, he began to push back against the vision. I am not just this, he growled. I am more than my worst deeds. I am Thicket, guardian of the Whispering Woods, and I choose to be more. As Thicket rejected the vision, he felt something fundamental shift within him. The guilt that had been crushing him didn't disappear, but it transformed. Instead of a weight dragging him down, it became fuel for his determination to make amends, to do better. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the dungeon, Thicket broke free of the dark energy's grasp. As his vision cleared, he saw his companions doing the same, each overcoming their own personal demons. The sorcerer's enraged scream echoed through the chamber. Impossible. You cannot resist me. But they had. Battered, shaken, but unbowed, Thicket and his allies stood before the pulsating orb of darkness. They had faced the very heart of the curse and emerged stronger for it. It's time to end this, Thicket growled, his voice filled with newfound strength and purpose. Together we can shatter this orb and break the sorcerer's hold over us. As one, the unlikely band of rebels moved towards the floating sphere, ready to strike at the source of their torment. The dungeon trembled around them, and the sorcerer's voice rose in a furious incantation. The final battle for their freedom was about to begin. Thicket met the eyes of each of his companions, seeing in them the same mix of fear, determination, and hope that he felt. Whatever the outcome, they would face it together. And in that moment of unity, facing the heart of the curse that had enslaved them for so long, Thicket felt truly free for the first time in centuries. For our future, he roared, raising a clawed hand high. For our redemption. And with that battle cry echoing through the chamber, they charged towards their destiny. The chamber trembled as Thicket and his allies charged towards the pulsating orb of darkness. The air crackled with conflicting energies, the sorcerer's malevolent magic clashing with the sheer willpower of the rebels. As they neared their target, the sorcerer's disembodied voice boomed through the chamber, equal parts fury and desperation. You dare to challenge me? I, who gave you power beyond measure. Tendrils of shadow lashed out from the orb, attempting to ensnare the advancing group. Thicket roared in defiance, swatting away the dark energy with newfound strength. You gave us nothing but torment and guilt. He bellowed. No more. Beside him, his unlikely companions fought with equal determination. Whisper the Wraith phased through the shadowy attacks, her ethereal form disrupting the sorcerer's magic. Grimclaw's nimble goblin hands worked quickly, using purloined magical trinkets to create bursts of protective light. Lurch the troll used his massive bulk as a shield, allowing the smaller creatures to advance. But the sorcerer was not easily defeated. With a thunderous crack, the floor beneath them began to splinter and shift. The very walls of the chamber came alive, morphing into grotesque shapes that lunged at the rebels. Fools, the sorcerer cackled. This dungeon is an extension of my will. You cannot hope to. His words were cut short as, to everyone's shock, Skitter the Rat Man leapt onto the orb itself. The clever creature had used the chaos of the battle to maneuver unnoticed. Now, Boss Skitter squeaked, his tiny claws scrabbling against the smooth surface of the sphere. Hit it with everything you've got. Thicket didn't hesitate. Summoning every ounce of his strength, every shred of his true self that he'd reclaimed, he lunged at the orb. His massive claws, once instruments of mindless destruction, now struck with purpose. The moment Thicket made contact, a blinding light erupted from the point of impact. He felt a surge of energy course through him, ancient and familiar, the power of the forest he'd once protected. Visions flashed before his eyes, but not of violence and guilt. Instead, he saw sunlit glades, heard the whisper of wind through leaves, felt the pulse of life in the soil. For a breathtaking moment, Thicket was once again the majestic guardian spirit of the Whispering Woods. No, the sorcerer's voice wailed, tinged with genuine fear. This cannot be. The orb's surface began to crack, lines of golden light spreading across its darkness. Thicket pressed his advantage, pouring every bit of his rekindled essence into the assault. Together he roared to his companions. Strike now. As one, the band of former monsters attacked. Whisper's ghostly hands phased into the fissures Thicket had created. Grimclaw hurled his most potent magical charms. Lurch brought his fists down with earth-shaking force. Each of them fought not just with physical might, but with the full force of their reclaimed identities. With a sound like 1,000 mirrors shattering, the orb of darkness exploded. A shockwave of released energy knocked everyone off their feet. Thicket felt the curse's hold wavering, its iron grip loosening for the first time in centuries. As the dust settled, Thicket struggled to his feet, blinking in confusion. The chamber was transforming around them, but not in the chaotic, menacing way it had before. Instead, the oppressive darkness was receding, replaced by a soft, natural light. The sorcerer's voice came once more, but it was faint and fading. "This isn't over," it hissed. "You may have disrupted my control, but the curse remains. I'll find a way to." Whatever final threat the sorcerer intended was lost as his presence vanished entirely from the dungeon. A profound silence fell, broken only by the bewildered murmurs of Thicket's companions. Grimclaw was the first to speak up. Did we win?" Thicket looked down at himself, noting that his monstrous form remained unchanged. Yet something was different. The constant pull of the curse, the background noise of rage and hunger that had plagued him for so long, was greatly diminished. "But not entirely," Thicket rumbled. "But we've struck a mighty blow. The sorcerer's direct control over us and the dungeon is broken." A ripple of jubilation went through the group, but Thicket raised a clawed hand for silence. "But our fight isn't over. The curse still lingers, and the sorcerer is wounded, not defeated. We've won our freedom to choose, but the harder road of redemption lies ahead." As if in response to his words, the chamber's transformation completed. They found themselves in a vast cavern, lit by bioluminescent fungi and crossed by underground streams. It was as if the dungeon, freed from the sorcerer's corrupt influence, was trying to heal itself. "What now?" Boss Lurch asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. Thicket looked at each of his companions in turn, seeing the mix of hope and uncertainty in their eyes. "Now," he said slowly, "we rebuild. We turn this dungeon from a prison into a sanctuary. We work to break the curse entirely and find a way to make amends for the wrongs we've done." He paused, feeling the weight of his next words. "And we prepare. The sorcerer will return, and we must be ready. But this time we'll face him on our terms, not his." As his companions nodded in agreement, Thicket felt a flutter of something he hadn't experienced in ages: excitement for the future. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges both external and internal. The curse still whispered in the back of his mind, a reminder of the constant vigilance required to maintain his true self. Yet as he looked at the determined faces around him, Thicket felt a surge of optimism. They had faced their darkest memories, confronted the worst parts of themselves, and emerged stronger. Whatever came next, they would face it together. "Come," Thicket said, turning towards an unexplored passage that seemed to lead upwards. "Let's see what other wonders and challenges this new chapter holds." Thank you so very much for listening to this story. I thoroughly hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe, leave a like, and comment too. I hope to see you on the next adventure.